This conference will now be recorded.
All right, welcome everybody. This is Stephen McCord, one of the Northern California directors for Chalmers of California Lake Management Society. And thanks for joining us for a noontime webinar for the month of May. Before we get started, I want to, let me share this. I just want to give a shout out to our sponsor for today's webinar. It's Clean Lakes Inc. And you can see all the things that they do up here, mostly related to aquatic herbicides, but also dredging, aeration, and all kinds of fun stuff around California and more broadly than that. And I seem to see their name everywhere. So they're doing great work around California and beyond, and sponsoring today's webinar. The funds for these webinars, whatever sponsorship stuff we get, goes towards student scholarships. And this year, I think we popped out again. It's 5 or 6. I should know I'm on the scholarship committee, but we gave out 5 or 6 scholarships, totaling like each one of $1,250 or $1,500, something like that. So thanks to the sponsors and everybody participating and things like that. So thanks again to Clean Lakes for that. And somebody's got a dual audio on, so make sure. I see a couple of callers that are not on mute. Everybody else is doing a good job of that. And if you can't figure it out, I can probably mute you from the side. Here, let me do that. A second. Yeah, okay, I just muted the 2 callers. And before I turn it over, let me point out a couple of features. Not everybody knows GoToMeeting like Zoom and some others. There is a chat feature, so everybody's doing great about being on mute and invisible, not on video. The way to communicate during is through the chat feature. So if you click on that, you can chat to everyone or just any other individual through the little drop-down menu. And at the end of it, I'll be monitoring this during the presentation, and if there's an urgent question, I might interrupt Doug, but otherwise we can capture those at the end. So if a question comes to you, you can type it in there, you can send it at any time, and we'll capture those at the end. There'll be some time for Q&A. So with that, let me introduce Doug Chalmers. He's going to be presenting. He's a scientist with Stockholm Environment Institute, the U.S. Water Group. He's based in Seattle, although he was in Davis. Yeah, that's where I am. Works on water resources modeling and planning in California using WEAP, and he'll tell you what WEAP is. He joined SEI in 2018, so about 4 years before COVID, the placeholder. And since joining SEI, he's helped build water allocation models using water rights data. He's also supporting the Valley Water and a project that he's going to talk about today. He went to Oregon State University for graduate school and got a master's in water resources engineering, a minor in water resources policy and management, and a graduate certificate in water conflict management and transformation. So he's well suited for his position now. And his BS is from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which has one of the most studied lakes in America. And then Marissa Escobar, also with SCI, she'll be listening in and probably helping out with some of the Q&A and that sort of thing. She's the program director at SCI based in Davis. Originally from Bogota, but now she's here, and somebody else in the U.S. is in Colombia, running a lot of the South America operations. So thanks both of you guys for joining. So let me turn it over to you, Doug. Here.
All right. All right. Everybody see the screen and hear me okay?
Yep, that's great.
Perfect. So thanks, Stephen, for the intro. And my talk today is called Assessing Reservoir ReOperations to Improve Aquatic Habitat. And in this talk, kind of a few different angles here that I've stitched together. So I'll be starting with an intro on some of the background of environmental flows, and then some of the frameworks from the environmental flows we applied to the case study on reservoir ReOperations that we did with Valley Water. And there's a few of the Valley Water folks on today, which is great. And then, depending a little bit on the interest of you all, we developed and applied a new tool called Aquatic Habitat Assessment to produce the results in the case study. So I have more material that relates specifically to that tool. And I'm reading the chat, so feel free to kind of ask me any questions in there. If you're more specifically interested on one of these specific components, let me know too, and I can try to cater the talk a little bit. So like I said, we'll start with a bit of a background on environmental flows. Probably review, but environmental flows is the concept of keeping water in stream to keep our aquatic species alive and avoiding running dry. And quantity and timing are two important concepts related to environmental flows that I'll be discussing. So why do we care? Why are environmental flows important? If we think about the context of two of the species that were involved in this case study, one of them being steelhead trout. It's a threatened ESA species, and we're down to less than 10% of the historical population. And part of this, one window right within Santa Clara County where this case study is that between the three stream system, 21 to 54% of the habitat is blocked by urbanization and dams. So habitat's blocked, fishing, urbanization, temperature effects from climate change, so threatened and really dwindling species numbers. Similar story for the fall-run chinook. It's a species of concern, and it really used to be one of the most abundant fish runs in the whole state of California. And what I find alarming was that even by the early 1900s, it was already down to less than 10% of its historical population. And surely is just a fraction of what it was back 100 years ago. So even just in the gold mining days, already the habitat was so degraded that we saw such significant numbers lost for a species that was once so abundant. And as it stands now, 60% of the total habitat is blocked by dams, which, given that that's such a big habitat area, that's quite alarming. And yeah, thanks, Stephen. ESA is Endangered Species Act. So what can we do to help these species? The numbers are dwindling, the habitat we're losing it. To help, the research question today is, how can flow policies optimize both aquatic habitat and human water use? If we visualize the trade-offs and the benefits of water allocation for human water supply versus ecosystem health, what we're talking about is kind of trying to get at the decision space around here. We're getting most of the benefits of both of these, but the full benefit of neither. And this is kind of a realistic, perhaps pragmatic mindset of, we have millions of people that we have to feed and that live in cities. But at the same time, we don't want these important species to just collapse. So we have to think about what quantity do we allocate to these flows? And then be smart about the timing. So what timing will maximize the habitat benefits of a given allocation? And if we're smart about our timing, if we visualize this, we can think about it as we're getting more ecosystem benefits for any allocation of environmental flows. So being really smart about them to get the most benefit. So right now, there's a paradigm kind of minimum flows, where if we kind of look at an overlay of a number of different natural hydrographs, minimum flows will take some sort of low-end running average. And maybe they're a little more sophisticated than what I've drawn here. You know, maybe it changes by season or by month, but the notion is that the timing is very oversimplified. And the native species that have adapted to this variability and the Mediterranean patterns and the highs and the lows, they're not adapted to this unnatural sort of flat pattern. And we might actually be inviting in invasive species who are better adapted to such a hydrograph. And to do better, to make better environmental flow policies, let's think about the timing and let's think about making it a little more sophisticated. And how we want to do that is we need to provide the flows that these species have adapted to. And that ties back to these biological life stages. And these salmonids, they live in most of their lives in the ocean, and they travel upstream to cold freshwater streams to reproduce. So in these life stages, it starts with adult immigration, where they travel upstream, and then the fish spawn in these cold freshwater headwater areas. From spawning, they lay eggs, and the embryos incubate until they hatch into fries. And then the young fish will feed in the freshwater stream until they become large enough and become angsty juvenile teenagers and need to leave home. Once they're big enough to travel downstream, they'll go into the ocean and they'll feed out in the ocean, become hopefully big and fat and healthy. And then the cycle starts all over again, where after a number of years of growing, they will return back to the streams that they were born in. So probably review, but these life stages really sets the stage for how the environmental flow policies need to be designed. And when we look at the species in question for this case study, we have the steelhead, which they will come into the streams and reproduce kind of in late winter, early spring. And there will be a little bit of over-summering fish. So fish that are growing and they'll live in the streams over the course of the summer until they're large enough to emigrate the following year. The fall run chinook, keeping to their name, they will travel upstream kind of in the fall and the early winter. And then will tend to leave the stream by the summer. And these time periods are really important for the times when we need to provide different types of flow. And this is all a lead-in for a way to improve upon minimum flows, which is a concept called functional flows. And this is a framework that has been formally developed by the California Functional Flows Work Group. And that includes a number of professors at UC Davis, UC Berkeley, and Utah State, Sarah Yarnell, Ted Grantham, Belize Lane, Sam Sandoval, and Marisa Escobar has been involved in bringing these concepts forward as well. And functional flows, it really thinks back to those life stages, and it thinks about how can we preserve those key functions which really keep the species alive. If we look at our Mediterranean hydrograph here of just an example stream in California, some of these key functions that we see is a high winter base flow during the wet season, these large peak magnitude flows, which are naturally provided by storms, and they kind of reset some of the geomorphology, so they mix up the sediment and the rocks to provide good habitat. And it also stimulates a lot of migration events. Then we have the spring recession flow, where the flow kind of tapers off gradually in the spring, and it gives the species sort of a alert of, hey, it's getting hot and dry up here. It's probably time to get down to the ocean. The summer is the natural dry season, so the flows are low. They're usually not completely zero, depending on where the stream is. And then in the fall, to kind of kickstart the migration season, are some fall pulse flows, where those first big fall storms can stimulate migration to return back to the freshwater areas. And functional flows, it tries to think of how can we give these species these key aspects of the hydrograph, these key functions. It doesn't really call for the total restoration of natural flows. Again, it's kind of that pragmatic middle ground idea of keeping benefits for humans while still preserving benefits for fish. And there are some tools, it's called the Functional Flows Calculator, which provides some guidance on how to build in-stream flow requirements. So it might look something a little like this. That was a mess. And it makes variations for wet years versus dry years. I think that this is probably even a little simplified for the type of flow requirement you could make with it. But the idea is that, see, it's still kind of simple. It's still sort of formulaic and you can apply it, but it's not quite like the minimum flows, which are just a little more arbitrary. It really provides things like the peak flows and the pulse flows and caters to flows to when the fish have adapted to them in the natural pattern. So with that, with these concepts that we've talked about, this was some of the ideas that we took to our case study with Valley Water in a project called FACE, where we looked at Reservoir ReOperations. And a little bit of a disclaimer, we didn't apply the functional flows framework directly in this study. I do think that the ideas are highly related, and that's why I've stitched them together here, but we didn't explicitly use that functional flows calculator tool in here. So just a disclaimer. So as I said, we worked with the Santa Clara Valley Water District, which is known as Valley Water. And they're centered around San Jose. So they're a water utility which provides municipal water service for Santa Clara County, which surrounds San Jose. And the stream systems are regulated, so they're highly controlled by the dams. And the dams are located kind of at the interface of where the foothills meet the valley floor. And they're located along what we call the Three Creeks watersheds. So it's Stevens Creek, Coyote Creek, and then the Guadalupe River, which runs right through downtown San Jose. And then they all go to the San Francisco Bay. The project we did was called the Fisheries and Habitat Collaborative Effort, or FACE. And the goal of FACE was to design reservoir ReOperations to make better habitat for those fish. So those fish that are losing, 50% of their habitat due to urbanization and dams, how can we restore some of that and boost up their populations while still kind of trying to keep that best of both worlds sort of middle ground concept that we talked about between the natural species and human supplies? That was the goal. So what we did, and our role as SCI in this was we provided technical support to kind of help brainstorm and do iteration model runs to help design these proposed reservoir reoperations. And they're proposed. So, another disclaimer, this hasn't been implemented, and SCI wasn't directly responsible for creating them either. But what we see, this is a sample too. So this is just 1 year of an example, but it kind of gets at the main differences between the original operations and the reoperations. And what you can see from the original is high flows in the summer and low flows in the winter. So it kind of matches the human demand pattern. And the basics of the reoperations is that it restores a little bit of that natural hydrograph. We have higher flows now in the winter than before. We see again a lot more pulse flows to simulate those natural storm events. And we see lower flow in the summer, which we guarded some of that over-summering steelhead rearing habitat by providing cold water management. So even though flows in the summer are lower, the fact that they're colder hopefully means that the fish will be okay. And again, this, I think, is pretty similar to the functional flows concept. We're trying to provide those key ecosystem functions and kind of taking that middle ground of providing releases for human needs while also going a little bit back towards the natural hydrograph pattern that the species have adapted to. So how did we do in these reoperations? Did it help? We quantified the habitat suitability using the tool, which I have more slides on at the end of this presentation, called Aquatic Habitat Assessment, which is run in our model WEAP, which stands for Water Evaluation and Planning. And it's a water allocation model, if I had to pigeonhole it. And WEAP is developed by SCI, and it's used a lot for decision support and kind of high-level system-wide models. And by using the Aquatic Habitat Assessment, again, we quantified the suitability of the habitat between the original versus the reoperations. And here they are very aggregated, so all a 20-year modeling period across all locations in the 3 creeks. So these are the results for the life stages where the fish are living in the freshwater areas, so spawning, incubation, and rearing. And what we see is a couple of these, we see significant increases of up to 25% greater habitat than the original operations. And some of the others, they're pretty similar within a few percent. So modest, positive, but modest, I would say. Where we prioritized where we prioritized the benefits was the fish passage, and that's where we saw a lot of the greater benefits. So here we're seeing benefits more towards 25 and 40%. So here for the fish passage, again, we are restoring a lot of that habitat where we said between 21 to 54% of the habitat was said to be lost due to these dams, but at least now we're getting back 25% of it, at least from changing the operations. So to lump these all together, total ballpark, a lot of the the devil's in the details for the specific timings and locations, but total ballpark, we're seeing about 15% benefits to the fish habitat for a trade-off, a real trade-off of about 1% to the water supply delivery. So that was our attempt. We came at these proposed reoperations, which for the Valley Water folks, I am talking about FACE Plus here. I know that we have another alternative, which is just the FACE operations, but what we kind of came up with after a lot of iterations, this was our best attempt to get at that kind of best of both worlds, really improving the habitat without too much of a unacceptable trade-off to the human water supply. I see a question from Stephen. In addition to flow volumes and temperature for habitat benefits.
You can hit those at the end. I'm thinking about them, so put them in there.
That's okay. And if we look back here, because I know some of those aggregated ones, there wasn't much of a change, and that might seem surprising for reoperations that are specifically meant to increase habitat. But the dominant effects of what we really see is you have to look more at the monthly pattern. The habitat across the board, we do see more substantial increases during this wet season. And during the period of the dry season releases, what we see is that even though we're releasing less water than before, that cold water management, we're being really smart and careful about always releasing cold water. That let us kind of hold our own and let the habitat at least not decrease very much during the summer. So we really increased it during the winter and mostly held our own during the other months. And if we think back to the life stages, that's important because the winter increased flow period from November to April, that's when most of the most important parts of the life stages are happening. The migration, the spawning, the incubation of the eggs. And then kind of outside that period, we have some of the fringes of some of the other life stages. We do have the over-summering rearing of the steelhead, which we try to keep alive with the cold water management. But this really gets more at the functional needs of the fish, right? Most of their reproductive life stages happen during the natural wet season. So we're trying to kind of give them that winter habitat back that they've adapted to. So after that, what are some recommendations kind of at a high level that I can share on environmental flows? I would argue that they need to be variable. They shouldn't be so simplistic, and they need to be targeted towards the real functions of the fish that we need to fill. At the same time, this is tricky because they need to kind of be formulaic or systematic enough that managers and operators can actually implement them effectively. And they need to be efficient. Again, tying back to that middle ground approach, from my point of view, I feel like the human uses of water in California are pretty efficient. I don't feel like we waste a lot of water in this state. And in order to really defend and pass these flow policies and make them feasible, the policymakers and decision makers, they need to stand up in front of some people who might suffer from these and might be curtailed. So we need to make their efficiencies defensible and say, no, this is really what the fish need, and we're being smart about it, and we are being careful with the flows that we do provide. And all of this, I think, did tie into both that functional flows concept and the reoperations that we helped look at for the case study. So I'm going to share one final slide here that gives kind of the main idea of the tool that we use to quantify the habitat results. And then from there, we can open up for questions, and then depending on the interest of folks, I do have more detailed slides and some of the intricacies of the tool, but this may not be the most appropriate place for those. I don't want to bore people with all the engineering details. But one slide on aquatic habitat assessment. Again, that's the tool that we used in the WEAP model. And we shortened it to AHA or AHA. And AHA, it's used really to quantify. Getting that hard number is a lot of the appeal of it for the habitat suitability and the fish passage. And it takes that water management scenario, maybe it's the original operations versus the ReOperations. And then using WEAP, we simulate the operations to get the stream flow at each time and location in a daily model. We took many cross sections from HEC-RAS hydraulic model, and using those cross-section hydraulic model, we were able to relate the stream flow then to the depth and velocity. And the fish, during their different life stages, we took biological suitability curves, where here at the top is the most suitable, 1, and then 0 means they can't survive at all. So here is the range of depths that chinook salmon like in riffles. And by knowing how suitable is a certain depth, how suitable is a certain velocity, we can then connect stream flow all the way to quantified habitat suitability and passage conditions. And by modeling the operations then and connecting the operations to the stream flow, then we've completed the whole loop where we can analyze the comparison of what's the quantified effect of habitat of our different water management scenarios. So I'll pause here. And I think I've covered really most of what I want to. I do have more detailed information on the nitty-gritty of this tool, but I think that this really gives you what you need to know. So I'll open it up for questions.
All right, this is Steven. I keep thinking of questions myself, so I'm typing them in here. But other folks can too. Here's one last one. So those are just ones I put up there for folks to consider that I was thinking about. But please ask other questions. This is the time to do it. So Doug, you're welcome to prioritize these and we look for other comments coming in.
Sure. Well, in the time here, I'll tackle your first one here. So in addition to flow volumes and temperature for habitat benefits, other conditions like organic carbon, pH, DO, can benefit or harm downstream wildlife. Were those conditions also used for reoperation constraints or suitability? So I guess thinking a little bit about how does water quality tie in here? Right, and I guess the Valley Water folks can chime in. I feel like we used flow and temperature kind of as a proxy for the other ones. Thinking that if we're providing fresh flows to kind of clean everything out and making sure that we don't have too stagnant of flows. And the velocity was part of it too, right? So the fish, we did try to give the fish the velocities that they were looking for as well, which I would think would also translate to water quality. But it wasn't explicitly considered, at least not from the angle that I was working on.
There are some while you were talking, there were some callers who were having side conversations or something, so I muted you. Let me try it. I'm not sure if you can indicate if you want to be off mute or not. So I'll try to do that in case any of the callers want to ask a question. Anyone else you could ask verbally?
I see, that's a good question from William. Has groundwater recharge been considered as an additional benefit? So, yes, we did. One of the big missions of Valley Water is groundwater recharge. And from what I remember, actually, groundwater recharge was not improved under Face Plus, the ReOperations. The Valley Water folks maybe can speak up if I have that wrong, but my memory was that because we're releasing less in the summer is when those streams, they're dry, it's hot, it's just sucked down way more in the dry summer than the wet winter. In the wet winter, if you send flow downstream, it's much more likely to flush all the way out to the bay. So we saw about 2% less groundwater recharge actually but the groundwater recharge, there were some simplifications, I think, in the groundwater element of the WEAP model. So that may not be the takeaway number, but shifting the release from the summer to the winter actually did have negative effects for groundwater recharge, unfortunately. I see a question from Stephen about, in my results, why did I list the original operations as 100%? And I did that because this was a comparative tool. The extent of the utility of this aquatic habitat assessment is that it's really meant to be used as comparison. The numbers, it's calculated in units of surface area, but those numbers really in and of themselves aren't valuable so much as the percent change. So you're right. The 100% just means relative to the original operations. It doesn't mean relative to in absence of the reservoir operations at all. That actually was a scenario that we ran, and maybe that would be a better thing to compare these to. Compare it to how everything looks with no district operations. But right now, this was just comparing. I just tried to keep it simple and compare the ReOperations versus the original.
I see Mark Silos, who works at Valley Water, has a question similar to one of mine, but he probably said it better.
So, how would reservoir operations change on a dry versus wet year? The details do escape me a little bit. I know that a big piece of the operations is that on May 1st, there's kind of this cold water accounting period where we see how much cold water storage do we have, assuming that basically we get no rain until at least December.
Yeah.
And then from that, you see, you have your budget, like your diet of, we can release exactly 3 CFS, 5 CFS, whatever it is downstream throughout the summer. And I know too, the pulse flows is a big part of that too. When we have a lot of water, I think that we're more able to provide more frequent and larger pulse flows. But then on the other side of things, something that we really owned in on, or especially for the more iteratively designed Face Plus operations that I showed, was let's hold our ground. Even in the dry years, let's provide something. Let's give them a chance. Let's provide flows to get them upstream. Let's provide pulse flows to get them downstream. And even in the drier years, let's give the fish a chance to reproduce and to migrate. So that was something that I think was one of the biggest changes over the original operations, was just a greater number of possible years for reproduction. Yeah, thanks, Jason. You can join in if you want. I think you might know more of the details than me.
Yeah, so then they do say on the mount release, so it is sort of gauged to the storage.
Yeah, we have constraints here. You know, I think even in totally natural conditions, I don't know to the extent that Santa Clara County was like the singular best habitat for steelhead and chinook. And there's just only so much local water, and there was many years where to provide all these pulse flows and these winter flows, it's just not there. So try as we might, we had real limitations for really what was possible. It was, you know, it's scarcity. Even in natural conditions, it's still, I think, dominated by an environment of scarcity a little bit. To connect that to Stephen's question about did we consider climate change? So that was a contentious issue. I think a lot of the folks who are advocates on behalf of the fisheries wanted a lot of analysis for climate change. We ran some temperature sensitivity analysis. So if the stream temperatures increased, what would be the effects on habitat? I think it was sensitive. I don't remember the exact details, but the cold water management did a good job of keeping the streams cold. Some life stages were affected. I want to say it was probably more the ones in the summer. And I guess what we did look at was from the 20-year period from 1990 to 2010. Then we did slice and dice it a little bit, and we said what happens in the dry years, what happens in the hot years, and then we did compare those. But it's definitely a good question of what would happen with even greater climate change.
See the question at the end, William?
Yeah, so are existing riparian right extractors factored into the model? Yeah, so I know the issue you're trying to raise because I work in water rights with the State Water Resources Control Board, and right, those riparian and pre-1914 rights, there isn't much of an ability to not provide the flows that they want. You know, they really get that first draw at things. The water supply operations of this model were extremely complicated. There was municipal supply, there was agriculture supply. Given that this was kind of more of an urban area, I don't know to the extent that we kind of have riparian water right holders being as large of an effect so much as things like municipal water districts. But the water supply, it was a big effort to model that, and the things like the imported water deliveries and how those might change. There were a lot of questions there. So I'm sorry if that doesn't answer your question super directly.
But Doug, the model, I mean, it's the entire valley water system that you're simulating, right? The 10 reservoirs or something, plus imported, plus the groundwater recharge.
Yeah, we have, in many of our other slides about the model, we talk about how we have like 1 million result variables, I don't know, thousands of inputs. This was I don't know everything because it's so complicated. It's the operations of the entire utility system. But that is right. The water rights would be taken into account. Any demands, any groundwater recharge, transfers between reservoirs, imports, rules around all of those things. It was a big effort to calibrate those.
So,
maybe I can add something.
Sure, go ahead, Marcia.
Yeah, I mean, this was an effort, or it's even an ongoing effort today, still to continue to look at the model and look at the results and make sense of what's there. And just, you know, as Doug said, there's a big history behind what he presented today, and it was originally a monthly model, then we moved it into the daily time step. So for every time step in that time period, we are looking at all those conditions of water supply, water demand, and the model distributes the water based on the priorities as well. And in this reoperations process, we were assigning the high priority to the environmental flows or the functional flows, and those were a function, as Jason said in the text, in the chat, of the amount of water of the reservoir in the reservoirs and also of the cold water pool. So all of those factors combined for each of the time steps, making decisions based on those rules for each of the conditions in a given moment of the year is what the model was able to capture. So of course there are many details and things that are there, but that was kind of the big effort that went into trying to put this all together and define those new operations that will be better for these habitat conditions.
There, we see Eric commented there that there are a lot of extractors, so that point's not that relevant here. Most of it's operated by and for valley water. Their water reuse, they're pretty holistic system with the reservoirs and groundwater. Any more questions? All right, I guess we can call it end of the meeting. So to hear voice. So thanks everybody for joining and participating in this. Thanks Doug in particular and Marissa for preparing for this and presenting and sharing all this information. It's the WEAP model is a great tool, and reservoir operators and managers, like most of the Chalmers members, should know it's good for them to know that there are tools out there that can help them operate individual reservoirs and understand the watersheds and systems like valley waters. So thanks for sharing that. And we do this is recorded. I'm not sure what Doug, you can get back to me afterwards about what we can post. You can share a link to this video of this, or just a PowerPoint file or whatever as a PDF. And then I don't see Ellie on. I thought we had another webinar scheduled for next month, but I wasn't seeing it where I thought I'd see it. So stay tuned for that. You'll get if you guys are on the email list for columns, then you'll get an announcement about that one. So Thanks again, and hopefully see you next month.
Thanks, everyone.